Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Andy Davidson, a Bram Stoker Award nominated author. He was nominated for his novel In the Valley of the Sun, but he's also written one called The Boatman's Daughter, and his most recent novel is called The Hollow Kind. And he holds an MFA from the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, him and the Manning family, but born and raised in Arkansas, so he's a Razorback. But he makes his home in Georgia now with his wife, Crystal, and a bunch of cats. I suspect when Andy writes, he's probably got 1 or more cats sitting in his lap, knowing the behavior of cats. Cats are also associated with evil sometimes. And
unfairly so.
Unfairly so, you say.
Unfairly so.
I was going to say, Andy, I think maybe, don't you, in your own imagination or paranoia, do you sometimes think that one of those cats is evil, or even a few of them have conspired against you? Does your paranoia or imagination ever take you that direction for a future piece of work?
No, I don't think they're evil. I think they're just sort of they are what they are. I think it was Werner Herzog that said something in some documentary about nature is chaos and murder. I think that's just cats are just according to their nature. They are what they are.
Isn't that the truth? I've been watching a lot of I've been watching a lot of TikTok and Instagram videos, and the ones I like are the wild animal videos, the big cats after their prey, or even the big cats fighting one another. And we are so shielded from that. What really is going on in this world, we live in a very protected environment, and but the real world out there is instinct, bloodlust, and it's just a matter of this is survival, this is how it works, was preordained, and it's brutal at times, but it also is the nature of things, as you say. Unfortunately, house cats don't do that kind of thing to people.
I always think of there was this trip that my wife and I took to Disney World years and years ago, and I had never been to their park. That's their zoo. I forget what it's called, Animal Kingdom. And we went to the tiger exhibit, and there was I guess a park ranger was there giving a demonstration on tigers, and he pulled out this gigantic rubber ball, and he said, this is like the equivalent of a Kong ball that your cats have at home. You put a treat in it and they'll work it until they get the treat out of it. Well, this thing was like the size of a tire, and it had these incredible claw marks in it where it had just been ripped apart. And he said, yeah, that's the tiger at play. So
yeah. The paws on a big cat, lion or tiger, they're immense. But
they're innocent in what they do. So yeah,
it's
no evil there.
No, it's all instinct. It's you can blame God for that, or Mother Nature, whatever you believe, but it's in the blood. I should also mention to our listeners that you teach at Middle Georgia State University. You teach composition and creative writing, which makes you a perfect guest for this, because we have guests on here who can further our agenda of being better and more efficient writers. Now, you are in the horror genre. So let me start by asking about, as a kid, growing up, if you were like the average kid when I was growing up, you watched a lot of scary stuff. And now you're probably half my age. So I mean, for me, I think in terms of something like the movie The Screaming Skull or The Tingler, or there was the weekly movie, it was just called Chiller, which you may not have any awareness of, but one of the programs I'm sure you do have awareness of, because it's classic, is the Twilight Zone.
Sure. Yeah, I've seen episodes of the Twilight Zone more as an adult than I did as a kid. I was big into movies when I was a kid, not so much TV, and so the Twilight Zone movie that came out in the 80s, I knew that really well, and it wasn't until years later that I had learned that some of those skits in that film were actually segments on the TV show done differently or whatnot. The John Lithgow segment on the plane, for example.
Yes,
I think was William Shatner in the show.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, he did several of them. Young William Shatner did several. And one of the things Rod Serling did, who happens to be from my part of the world, I grew up in upstate New York in the Binghamton area, and he's from Binghamton High, one of the Binghamton high schools, and smoked too much and ended up dying of heart ailments of some kind. But he really showed just how versatile horror could be. It didn't have to be the monster or whatever. In most cases, it wasn't the monster. It had to do with a lot of different aspects of life and imagination. So getting back to your youth, when you're talking about these movies that you were watching, were they horror movies? I mean, was that part of what your was on your menu as a viewer?
It was part of it. I mean, I watched everything. I was sort of omnivorous in the way I watched movies. I would go to video stores. We had about 4 or 5 of them in my small town. I say small, it was about 30,000 people, which I guess is relatively small compared to 100,000 or whatever. But
Sure.
we had a large number of video stores for a small town, and so I had memberships at all of these places, and I would just go and I rented the same movies over and over. So my parents would sort of roll their eyes at me a little bit because I'd bring home, Godzilla in 1985, and I would watch that for, the 5th time, and might watch it twice before I would take it back. So yeah, I mean, I watched science fiction, I watched fantasy, I watched horror, I watched action movies. Everything of the era I was almost a fan of. Of course, Star Wars, there were big loves like Star Wars. There were things that changed me forever. In 1989, I saw Tim Burton's Batman, and that kind of remolded and reshaped my whole perspective on movies. I think for the first time, I was really interested in how movies were made, as opposed to just watching a movie and enjoying it. I was suddenly interested in the costuming and in the production design and in the creativity and storyboarding and all of these elements that I didn't know went into film. When I was 10 years old, I kind of got on and got a deep love for. So yeah, movies were sort of a doorway into writing and into creativity for me and storytelling.
Why the horror genre? What really, because it could have been espionage, it could have been a lot of different things. Why horror?
Horror was books. I mean, books, I was not as broad in what I enjoyed. I didn't really read spy novels unless they were a James Bond novel. I mostly read horror novels as a kid. I started with Dean Koontz's book Watchers, which my mom read, and my parents were big readers, and they read horror as well. They read other things, but horror was a big thing in our house on the bookshelf. And I read Watchers, and I loved that. It had a sort of similar effect as the Batman film on me, in fact. I had read some Stephen King early, but I think the book that really tipped the scales for me was It. I think I read that when I was probably 12 or 13 for
Big
the first
book.
time. Yeah, huge book. Yeah, I remember my dad reading a passage, the opening of that book, out loud to me in the car. We were going somewhere, and he had it from the library or something, and that whole sequence with the clown and the storm drain and little Georgie getting his arm ripped off was terrifying. But it's also terrifying in the sense of like, this is so good, this is wonderful. I want to know what happens, and so I don't know what it was exactly about horror that clicked for me as a kid. Maybe it was just that impulse as a kid to be scared, that you enjoy the thrill of that, the nature of sitting under a sheet with a flashlight or something. I don't know. But yeah, horror was books. And so
Well, how do you define a horror novel? I mean, have you thought
yeah,
about that? I mean, in what way
oh
would you
sure.
say what makes it horror?
Horror for me is something that peels back a layer of reality. Um, and shows us something that we didn't expect to see, that frightens us. And that doesn't necessarily need to be supernatural, although it can be. I think you mentioned the Twilight Zone earlier. One of the great, wonderful things about the Twilight Zone is how so much of what happens in that show, in the various episodes that Serling did, the horror can be rooted in the most mundane thing. It can be rooted in, a dummy that you're a ventriloquist and you're dummy, or it can be rooted in a neighborhood that seems idyllic on the surface, things like that. And so I think horror peels back something and shows us what's underneath it. It moves the rock, essentially.
Yeah.
And whatever's under the rock could be horrifying and disgusting. It could be a dead body. It could be a finger. It could be an ear crawling with ants. It could be a hole to another dimension, or it could just be a secret, something that we didn't know about our neighbor, and that to me, like, that's one of the
Yeah.
wonderful things about the horror genre is it's so far reaching in terms of what it encompasses.
It really is. And you mentioned neighbor, and that's a great point, because we read in newspapers all the time about somebody who's done something horrific, and their neighbors are saying, we had no idea. He looked like a regular guy. He left for work every morning, and we had no idea what was going on in that house, what he was
Right.
up to, and so on. So what scares you, Andy? Apart from writing, not even thinking in terms of, well, this is scary, so I make it a piece of writing. We know your cats don't scare you. What scares you?
Um, my fears tend to be more existential. They tend to be rooted in the things you can't control, So I would say I've been married now, my wife and I've been married since 2008, so that's about 15 years coming up. And in the early part of my marriage, I think one of the things that frightened me the most was, you wake up at that middle of the night and the person beside you is there and breathing, and what if they weren't? That just sudden sort of clutching fear of being alone or being without this person that you depend on so much to be your partner in life. That was one early on. I think Ray Bradbury called that was the soul's midnight, 3 a.m.
Wow.
So that's one. I would say lately my fears have become a little more existential with climate change and with the world sort of tilting toward oblivion.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Talk of
I don't know.
nuclear weapons being used, and
Yeah,
it's
these
it's
things
crazy.
they seem cyclical, like they come back, and it's like everything comes back. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I try to tap into, well, when I was a kid, we were in the Cold War, and I didn't go around thinking about nuclear annihilation, so maybe there's not a reason to now. But as an adult, it's like you have this mechanism as a child, right, to push things aside and not be as afraid. And when you become an adult, I don't know if it's the fact that you realize you're that much closer to your own mortal end, or is it that you've just lost that ability? You have more at stake, and so you've lost that ability to not be afraid of what you might lose. I don't know, but yeah, that's sort of a tangent, but yeah.
So let me ask you, what you have during the introduction, I mentioned the Bram Stoker award that you were nominated for. There were other awards and accolades. So you had critical success. You've also had commercial success. I can tell that because when I look at Amazon, I can see you have hundreds of reviews of your books. Your latest one hasn't hit 100 yet, but it's new. But you got hundreds of your reviews of your other, your first couple, which mean, and those are just the people who reviewed it. So there's commercial success, there's critical success. What means more to you?
Oh man, that's a tough question.
That's why I ask it.
That's an achingly honest question, isn't it? You got to be honest with that question. I don't know. I think that's my honest answer is I don't want to say, oh, critical success means nothing. And I don't want to say commercial success means nothing, because that's a flat out lie. I mean, we all want to be successful in writing our books. But
are there other ways a book can be successful to you? Because we always think it's almost like this duopoly. It's between commercial success and critical success. And usually the books that are critically acclaimed are not big sellers, or big sellers are not necessarily critically acclaimed. Oftentimes, most of the time, they're not. But how else can a book be successful?
Well,
to the author,
artistically, I mean, that's the main measure of success for me with a book is, does a book succeed in being a whole artistically? Does it succeed in telling the story that it wants to tell, and does it tell it well? Does it tell it coherently? Does it tell it cohesively? And not only in terms of plot and story mechanics, but also I put a lot of stock and weight in language and other elements of fiction, say setting and point of view and things like that. Those things have to be consistent and strong for me as well. So certainly the pinnacle of when I finish a book and I send it to my editor sends back notes, and I work on the book based on her notes. The only thing driving my thought process at that point is getting it right on the page and making sure that when a reader reads the book, they're going to understand what I'm doing. And it doesn't always work, but I want it to be because the reader didn't get it, not because I didn't communicate it well. I think sometimes readers and authors just don't line up, and taste is a big factor. But for the author, you have to be artistically successful in the work you're trying to do. And that also means a bit of attention to language for me. Like I said, I like sentences that read well, that are poetic, that are not overly poetic and don't distract from action moving forward. So like a personal measure of success would be that, but back to the idea of commercial versus critical. I know that my editor would say awards are fine and well, but you want sales. And that's, of course, from the market perspective, and the commercial perspective. And she's right. I mean, I guess in terms of the two, I would always say I would rather be read by a large number of people, because I know I can do something well if I put my mind to it. And the more people that read me, the more people will buy my books. I think awards and critical acclaim and those sorts of things, they come with the territory eventually if you're doing your job right, maybe. And maybe they don't, and that's fine too. So I guess I would say commercial. Sort of talked myself into that corner.
You see, this is just by answering questions. Sometimes we clarify our own thinking. You stop and think about Stephen King. Sells hugely to this day for decades. No critical acclaim. In fact, the critics would say, basically, they'd pan him, and even he would call himself, because the thing about Stephen King is the guy I'm not quite sure how to say. I love the guy. I'm not a big fan of his books, honestly, but I love the guy. And he says, he called himself the Big Mac and Fries of
Right.
novels. So, instead of getting angry or firing back, it's just, and he also said, I do the best with what I've been given. And
Yeah.
that's all anybody can expect. That's kind of the measure of, are you putting in the effort? He clearly puts in the effort. But then later he became a critical success. I mean, the New York Times,
Mhm.
his book about the Kennedy assassination, the time warp,
Mhm.
11, what was it?
2263.
2263 was named one of the best novels of the year. I thought it was good. I read it. I thought it was good. I thought it was a little overwritten, but he does overwrite stuff. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But so what I'm getting at here, I get, is in line with critical versus commercial, but then also, I suppose if you're a real commercial success for long enough, even the critics will say good things about you. Although I'm not sure James Patterson or Danielle Steele ever got that. I do want to ask you though, I'm glad that you brought up the kind of sentence level writing, artistic writing. That's of course important to many authors. What horror writer out there today do you think sets the standard?
Stephen Graham Jones would
Stephen
be
Graham Jones. Okay.
the
I'm not
first
familiar with
person.
him. Okay.
He's got a book out today, actually. It's he has the book that I would say, if you want to check out his work, would be The Only Good Indians. That would be a great place to start. Stephen's one of those people who has been writing forever, and nobody is aware of him until suddenly a few years ago, when The Only Good Indians became a bestseller. Everyone's aware of him now, and he's kind of this mega voice in horror fiction, and a wonderful human being to boot. I think Stephen might be one of my favorite living writers. I would say also there's a writer from Arkansas, where I hail from, named John Horner Jacobs. And John is a writer whose output is not enormous. He doesn't write a book a year. But when he does write one, man, it's good. And it's good at that level of the sentence. The book I'm thinking of is called A Lush and Seething Hell. It's
A Lush and Seething Hell?
Yeah, it's two novellas together in a book. It came out a couple of years ago from, I want to say it was Viking. I've got it somewhere here. I was trying to see who the publisher was, but Harper. I think it was Harper Voyager. But anyway, yeah, it's a really great book. So John and Stephen are two people that spring to mind right away.
What do you think of Clive Barker, who's kind of moved away from the horror genre and more into fantasy?
I really love Barker's short stories. I've not read a lot of his novels, but his Books of Blood series.
Books of Blood, yeah. I've read several of those. Very good.
Yeah, I love those. Someone whose short fiction I really love right now that I read whenever it comes out is Paul Tremblay. Paul's stories are always interesting and kind of weird and strange. Nathan Ballengren. If you don't know Nathan's work, North American Lake Monsters, his collection of stories, is one of the greatest literary horror collections I've ever come across. And that term literary in horror circles can be kind of a dirty word. So, I say it with full knowledge of that. If anybody's listening to this who's like, wait a minute, he said literary. But yeah, those are some people. And I realize as I'm saying this, these are all men. I'm thinking too of people, if you wanted to go back into the well, there's always Shirley Jackson.
Yeah. I read her biography, and I read one of her. Is it The House on the Hill? Is that the name of the? She's got one called The House on the Hill, I think, or The Haunting of Hill House. That's it. Yeah. So John Horner Jones, Jacobs. John Horner Jacobs is the guy you were thinking of. Okay, I looked him up while we were talking. So your latest is called The Hollow Kind, as I mentioned earlier. Give us our listeners a summary of the book.
The Hollow Kind. is the story of a young woman and her son who come to Georgia from South Carolina, fleeing from an abusive husband and father. And they're fleeing to an old farmhouse on about 1,000 acres that the woman Nellie has inherited from her dead grandfather. And there's a whole history of the house that's wrapped up in the turpentine industry in Georgia that Nellie sort of uncovers as she's living there, and also something sinister in the woods that has long been a part of the land and has a grip on this family. So it's kind of a generational saga. There's a portion of the book takes place in what I would think of as the quote present day, which is 1989 in the novel. And then there is a portion that takes place around the turn of the century in the early 1900s, which deals with her grandfather, August Redfern, working the land and building the home and all of the things that go horribly wrong with that. So that's kind of a broken, fractured summary of the
high-level
book.
summary.
Yeah.
Now, how does it, is it, your previous novels, The Boatman's Daughter and
In the Valley of the Sun.
In the Valley of the Sun. Thank you. How is this one? Is it distinctive? I mean, how does it differ from your previous novels in terms of style? Is it distinctive from them, or are you the kind of author who says, look, if somebody's reading one of my novels, I want them to say that's Andy Davidson's voice, and there's a continuity to all of them?
Well, I wouldn't say so much voice. Yes. I approach every book kind of from the perspective of, I want to tell a story in a certain place about a place. And with my first novel, that place was West Texas. With my second novel, it was my home state near where I lived, Arkansas. And with this book, it was where I want to tell a story about the place where I live right now. And so that's one approach that I kind of take with the books early on, is where is it going to be set, and setting will be important to the book. But each book is different structurally. This book is very different from the others. One of the things about this book that I found to be a great challenge writing it was the structure. The chapters alternate between the present and the past. And so you'll have a chapter that takes place in 1989, and then we'll move back in time to the family in 1918. And it's very rigid. It doesn't switch up, because I as a reader, I think when I read a book where the author establishes early on a rhythm of movement in a book, and then suddenly halfway through violates that, that always frustrates me as a reader, because I've gotten into the groove of how this book works, and then suddenly the gears are shifting in a way that makes them grind for me. So I set forth the kind of challenge that in writing this book, I will alternate every chapter back and forth, which was a note from my editor initially. I had approached it slightly differently, and the editor said, what if we did this? And I said, okay, I'll do this, but this is going to be a little difficult because it means juggling a lot of pieces and moving things around, and ultimately was good for the book. So that's a major difference, is the other books have a more linear style, maybe with some flashbacks interspersed in sections and pieces, but this one is constantly moving back and forth in time.
Yeah. So the Hollerkind, I would love this line in the summary. The dust cover says, something lurks beneath the soil, ancient and hungry, with the power to corrupt hearts and destroy souls. Very much it sounds supernatural. Do you always deal with the supernatural?
I like the supernatural. I think sometimes horror doesn't quite feel like horror to me personally as I write it without some element of a monster or a creature or something that is simply beyond our understanding. It doesn't have to be, horror is a genre, again, as we were talking earlier, it casts a very wide net. So but that's just sort of personal tendency. Yeah, I tend to
Right.
favor the supernatural. I think
Yeah.
with my first book, In the Valley of the Sun, the supernatural is kind of what saved it. And so I'm a little loyal to that impulse. I had written that book as a sort of a straight detective or crime fiction kind of thing about a serial killer in West Texas. And in the revision process, before I submitted it to any agents or anything like that, it was just kind of flat on the page and I didn't know what to do with it. And I had been rereading Salem's Lot by Stephen King, and vampires were in the front of my head. And I thought, well, what if there's a vampire in this book? What if the serial killer in this book becomes a vampire? And it just suddenly, the whole book opened up in a way that it hadn't. And so I tend to be kind of loyal to the idea of monsters. Kind of a realist, but maybe.
I do think it's the supernatural that really scares people, and not even necessarily at a monster level. It's because a lot of people just don't believe in it. It's like Stephen, the late night host, Stephen Colbert. Thank you.
Yeah.
He said, now everybody's got cameras on their phones. Where's Bigfoot? All these Bigfoot studies. I mean, where's the pictures now? Because everything that's out there, we take photographs of. It's amazing what we catch, but. The supernatural being even, our own minds can scare us. Just what will happen with our own mind, whether it's something in terms of a disease or losing our bearings or what have you. What do you think really scares people? And actually, this question, I'm trying to get at a bigger portrait than that, I guess, because I'm wondering, is horror really about scaring people necessarily? And if it is, what do you think really scares people? Obviously, the supernatural is part of that. But is horror, does it have to scare people, or does it satisfy on a different level as well?
Well, I don't set out to try and scare people. I always think it's great if in your book a moment arises that can give someone a chill or make them deeply unsettled. Again, the Salem's Lot example is, for me, there's a scene in that book where there's two different effects that come in that book that I would say I kind of try for as a writer in horror. One of them, there's a scene where a little boy is walking in the woods and someone is following him, and there are sounds in the woods that are clearly indicating someone is, creeping up on him. And that scene, to me, I never read it without getting a kind of chill or a shudder. And your heart sort of speeds up. So there's a kind of direct physiological effect you can have on someone as a reader in horror, which is fear, or at least being deeply unsettled. The other scene in that book that I think of is there's a scene where the little boy, I guess to give it away, he's died. They've buried him. He's been attacked by a vampire in the woods. And the gravedigger is filling the grave. And the sun is going down as the gravedigger is filling the grave. And he begins to hear, I think, sounds inside the casket. And so he has to fill the grave quickly because something is happening in there. And it's not so much a jump scare. It's not a shock. It's just this slow unspooling dread of what's going to happen when the sun hits the horizon. And so for me, as a writer, that's what I shoot for, is that sense of dread, that sense of inevitability of something bad is going to happen. And then dealing too with the results of that on a realistic level. How do we grapple with something horrible that happens to people? So I don't know if horror is in the business necessarily of scaring people. It certainly can be. But in books, books are a kind of slightly different animal than movies. Movies can scare you in any number of ways visually. Books tend to work from the inside out. They get under your skin and go deeper, I think.
Now, I heard you say that you think film drives horror more these days than books do.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Well, it's a perennial genre in film, horror. Horror is almost always successful. You know, there was a time before Marvel when comic book films were not successful. They had sort of run their course. And then suddenly Iron Man comes out in 2008 and the world changes for comic book films as a genre. And now they seem to have no end, but you can always pick out little outlier films that try to cash in on that fail. I think in terms of horror, though, I can't think of a horror film that has come out that has not at least been a financial success in some way. I mean, even the movies that come out that are kind of bad almost have a built-in audience for them. But you know, horror just is a filmic genre in terms of its visual nature, in terms of what the medium does, and you're sitting in the dark, you know, watching these kind of dreams flicker in front of you. There's a lot of reason why film and horror hold hands really well. Books, horror right now in literature is really having a wonderful resurgence. And I have a fear, of course, as a horror writer, that's going to peak and decline, but it hasn't yet. It started in the, I guess, the mid 2000s, where we started suddenly seeing horror sections creep back into major bookstores where for 10 years before they had been vanished. And now you have booksellers at chain bookstores like Barnes and Noble who are actively cultivating horror sections. My Barnes and Noble here in Macon, Georgia, has 5 bays for horror, and they're not all Stephen King. I mean, he has one bay, you know, but there's 4 other bays full of people who are writing horror, and these are not necessarily indie presses. These are major publishers. And so in a way, horror is having a great time right now, literarily. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I mean, I think someone who might be willing to go and plop down $10 at a movie theater or watch a scary movie on Netflix is somehow less sometimes willing to pay $32 for a hardback novel and engage with it over the course of 5 or 6 days. You know, I can't say how many times I've encountered that as a horror writer when you go to a bookstore to do a signing or sit at a table and people come through. Someone inevitably, at least once per event, will tell you how they don't read horror, or will because you've written a horror novel, will look at what you've done as if it's you might as well say this is
a foreign language, maybe.
Yeah, or this is my work of pornography. Would you like to see it? You know, I mean, I don't know. It's strange. No matter how artistic you try to be, some people still say it's porn.
Right. So you're obviously a cinemaphile. So this might be a difficult question, but I was wondering if you, off the top of your mind, could come up with 2 or 3 horror movies that you consider, you know, some classics or the greats.
Sure. Let's see. Well, first movie that pops into my head is Jaws, which we think of as a blockbuster. We think of as a summer film. We think of it as an adventure film, but we don't necessarily immediately think of it as a horror film. But I think it is. In some ways, I think Jaws is a slasher film. So that's one. If you want to dig back into monsters, I really think that the Hammer films are amazing, especially Horror of Dracula, the first Christopher Lee Dracula film. One of the more more recent, I guess, films that I like to point out to people, and usually you either people know it and love it or have never heard of it, is Ginger Snaps, which is a Canadian film that came out in the early 2000s. It's a werewolf movie about a young woman and her sister who the older sister is bitten, and it's this wonderful kind of metaphor for adolescence and changing bodies and that sort of thing. But it's a great movie.
Was the movie Wolf with Jack Nicholson made after that? I know it was made
it came
after
before
it.
that.
Oh,
Yeah.
it came before that. Yeah,
Yeah.
but Ginger Snaps came before that.
No, Ginger Snaps was after. I think.
Oh, it
Wolf
was. Okay. See, I've heard of it. I've never seen the movie.
I think Wolf is the 90s maybe, and I think
that's right.
Ginger Snaps is 2000.
But same kind of concept where you have a bite and Jack Nicholson.
Oh yeah.
Well, he became developed the senses of a wolf, and
yeah,
which was quite interesting, and the behavior of a wolf in time. So I'm not giving anything away by telling people that. So interesting.
Yeah.
I've always thought that. What about Alien, the first one?
Oh yeah, fantastic horror movie. Yeah,
I thought it was a great decision to just to not let anybody see the monster for so long. You knew that you had this thing lurking, but you couldn't see it other than the beginning where obviously there was, the creature on the guy's face implanting. I guess you did see it early, but then there was this long period of time where you didn't know what you were dealing with. You just didn't know what you were dealing with.
Alien is one of those movies that I think horror does this so well. I mean, Alien is a slow burn. It takes half the film is over, and I think people don't remember this. Half the film is over before we see the creature burst out of John Hurt's chest at the dinner scene. That's like the midpoint of the film. And so much of the movie is set up. And that's why I think the latter half is so successful in many ways, is that the movie takes its time to really establish what a frightening environment this is on the ship, how lonely it is. These people are out in the far reaches of space. They're on their own. And yeah, you're right. Not showing the monster is one of those great tricks that works on the subconscious of the audience to great effect.
Another one is, although it's considered sci-fi more than horror, is 2001: A Space Odyssey, where Dave, the remaining astronaut, is there. It's a battle of wits with Hal, the central computer, and the isolation, the silence. You heard two things. I mean, one, it was silence, but then you also heard kind of the hissing of the oxygen being fed into the ship, and that isolation and that silence was just, it really was horrifying. It's that whole situation, that whole concept. Really did, and that was a substantial part of the film, where it was just the battle between man and machine.
And then the wonderful ending when the scientist is disconnecting Hal, and Hal begins to plead for his life.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so affecting.
It was. I'm glad you brought that up. It was amazing, because we talk about artificial intelligence, and could it ever have a survival instinct or have feelings, and that's exactly what they exploited in that movie in a perfect way. So it was very well done. So let me ask you this, Andy. You're a young guy. How do you expect your writing to change as you age? Do you have any sense of that?
I will say this: I'm deceptively young looking. Less so than I used to be. I'll put it that way. I'm middle aged.
Are you?
Yeah, I mean,
You're still young though. You're still a young guy. You got a lot.
Yeah.
The thing with writing is, a person can do. I mean, Philip Roth's an example of that. He did his best writing in the 70s and 80s. It's not something. It's not like being an athlete where it's like, God, the knees just won't do it anymore. So you have a long track ahead of you, God willing. So how do you think your writing or your perspective on your writing will change?
Well, I think life experiences shape us no matter what stage of life we're at, and that changes a writer's voice. In my case, I got out of graduate school when I was in my early 20s in the early 2000s, and I didn't really have anything to say about the world. I didn't know anything about the world. I'd been in school all my life, and I think it took moving far from home. I think it took living on my own. I think it took living 10 years, being married, having some grief, having some tribulations, having some love, all the wonderful things of life kind of conspired to shape me into a different person at 39 than I was at 29 or even 25. And so time created in me a sense of, you want to do this thing, you want to write, you better do it, because you're not getting younger. And also, who knows, if you don't do it now, maybe you're missing some narrow window of your life where you won't have the energy to do it 10 years from now, or you won't want to do it because you'll have given up on something, or
right.
Yeah, I don't know. So I got into writing compared to, like I mentioned, Stephen Graham Jones earlier. I think Stephen had written 20 novels before The Only Good Indians became a bestseller. It was his first commercial success. And Stephen was someone that was known, but he wasn't, universally known. I think he is more now. And I was very fortunate in my experience to write a book at 38, find an agent for it, and get it published before I was 40. And then I was doubly fortunate that book found an audience and was admired by people within the horror industry and has continued to sell, and you hear things in publishing about how no book sells more than so many hundred copies. And in graduate school, my mentor was Barry Hanna, and Barry talked about how, his average audience at his age in his 80s or late 70s was about the size of the Ole Miss football stadium, on a game day. So
Would have 50,000 or so?
I think it was like 80,000. Yeah.
80,000. Wow.
So like for me, that there's always been in my mind this kind of realistic approach to, you're probably not going to be a bestseller. You're probably not going to be universally known and like a household name, because most writers aren't anymore. It's just the reality of it. And so I do count myself incredibly lucky that I've moved farther than I thought I would in terms of readership and audience and publisher over the last few years. And that's created a great opportunity going into the future to keep writing books and see that audience grow, hopefully, if I keep doing what I'm doing well and
Right.
I don't blow it.
Right.
So I want, as I get older, to continue to grow an audience, but I want to continue being honest, and we're at different stages of our lives. And, I don't know that at 60, I can write a book for 20-year-olds. I may never write a book that appeals to a 20 or 30-year-old audience. I don't know. Maybe I will, but it just.
But you're always going to have your contemporaries who are aging with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're always going to have the younger writers who are coming up behind you, who are building a base as well. And so, yeah, there's a lot to be said about getting older being good, I think, as opposed to bad. So,
you mentioned your agent, and so there's millions of people out there writing, even as we speak, who are dreaming of having an agent say, I want to represent you. and the vast majority of them will never have that day come to pass. Go back in time to when you got the call or the email from your agent. What was that like? What was said? And bring us into that moment. What was it like? Because that's obviously a huge milestone.
Sure. Well, with my first book, I had a manuscript that I queried by email various agencies. And I didn't get any hits. And I mean, I probably sent out about, 20, 30 queries. And I sort of thought, I had no frame of reference for the industry in terms of, is 30 rejections a lot? Is it not? I don't know. And my wife, Crystal, she told me, she said, look, you need to meet an agent. You need to talk to somebody, see them face to face, know who they are as a human being as well. And she had heard about this writing conference in Nashville. And she said, look, they have these opportunities where you can meet an agent and talk about your manuscript and get a critique of your query letter. So why don't you just do that? Maybe that'll help give you a sense of what you're doing wrong. And so I said, okay. I've always sort of labored under the delusion that these kind of things were just meant to take money from writers who didn't have money, Right. But I went, and the agent that I was supposed to meet with couldn't be there. Her father had died. And so I had the choice of meeting with an agent or taking a critique by mail from the original agent. So I chose my second choice as an agent, who was at the time a young associate agent with a New York agency, who'd been in the business, that agency, for a long time, since the 70s. So she was looking to build her list, and I met with her, and I think we clicked right away in terms of perspective, in terms of work ethic, in terms of a lot of elements just sort of lined up magically. And she read the manuscript, and I think it was about 6 months after that initial meeting where we talked about it and she requested the pages, that I got a phone call, I want to say, from her. And she said, I want to offer you representation. And it was a wonderful moment because it wasn't out of the blue. I will stress that. Like, you have this thing in your head where you imagine one day someone calls and your life changes. It wasn't like that. It was more like you met someone, you've gotten a sense of how they communicate by email over several courses. She suggested some revisions to the book. I made those revisions. And once I made those revisions, I think she took me seriously as a writer and took me on as a client. And she since left that agency and started her own. I went with her, as did several of her clients, or most of them, I think, and is building a reputation for herself as an agent within the horror world at the moment, I think, to great success. So I will say that a great deal of my fortune, I think, is owed to having a good agent. So if I were going to say something to someone who is wanting an agent, maybe shopping for an agent, actually possibly even has an offer of representation on the hook from an agent, I would just say, make sure it's a good fit. Make sure this person is going to be a champion for your work, believes in your work. Because I've heard a lot of stories about agents that they don't know how to sell something. They don't, and it's not just the market. It's just they don't like the book, or they don't understand their own writer that they've signed on. Communication problems, ghosting people. These things happen. It's never happened to me because I'm so fortunate to have gotten an incredible agent. But these things do happen, and so be careful. If you are in the position of signing, just know what you're getting into. And
right, that's a great piece of advice.
And at the same time, like, just know that it's, like I said, it's not it may not be a magical experience. It may be a very workmanlike and marathon-like experience where you go through several stages of communication, and I think that's a good indicator, if it is possibly, that they're taking your work seriously.
Yeah, fantastic. Let me ask you about your teaching. You teach creative writing at Middle Georgia State University.
Yeah.
Middle Georgia State University. And there are people who say, look, creativity is something a person either has or doesn't. It can't be taught. But let's assume, I mean, you could also assume, look, if somebody's joining the class, they've got some creativity. Now it's a question of developing it to its optimal level. How do you go about working with your students? What are some of the pedagogy that you pursue with them? What are kind of some of the markers that you can share with us?
Sure. Well, I approach my creative writing workshops with the perspective that I'm teaching skills, not talent. So a student may come to the class wanting an elective. The student may come to the class wanting to learn how to write good stories. And so I kind of have to meet the students where they are. And I do that by just offering them, these are the elements of fiction. This is what a good sentence is. This is how you put all these things together. Now, whether they have the spark of being able to do that in an exceptional way or in a way that catches your eye as a reader, that's different. That is maybe what can't be taught. But what can be taught is definitely structure, approach, those sorts of things. And so I kind of come at it from an elements of fiction angle, which is probably not anything revolutionary. But I do remember when I was in graduate school, one of my instructors, one of my teachers in a workshop, told me that the story I had submitted, or my first workshop, was fine, but I really needed to turn the flame up under my language. And something in that advice made sense to me, and I understood it because I'd been reading other writers who did just that, had exceptional language in their books. And I understood, oh, okay, I need to try and do what other writers are doing. Not just what I do, but I need to do more and try to imitate people and try to learn from what people do. And so I made that bridge and connection in my own mind. And immediately, I think my stories kind of became better and took off a little bit. So I would say that I try to give my students that advice too. When I see someone that has the potential to really be good at this and is a serious writer. And I have a lot of writers actually that come into my classes saying, I want to do this. I just had a student who, put in her application to MFA programs at Brown and Iowa and Berkeley. I mean, it's just every major school you can think of. So you get all kinds of students who come to you for various reasons in your classes, and I think it's just a matter of meeting them where they are. So yeah, I mean, skills are really crucial, I think, for me as a teacher, that if you can put a sentence together, if you can understand a beginning, a middle, and an end, and distinguish those and create something that has those, then you can write a story.
Is there some problem with writing or issue that you see most often? Is it dialogue? Is it structure? Is it lack of, they have not turned up the flame on their prose, that sort of thing?
Man, it's developing into a pet peeve, and so I have to watch myself, or I get really angry. But for some reason, students, I see, have a real problem with understanding how to punctuate dialogue. And so I guess for me as a reader, I always just understood it because I had read so many books and seen it done so many times, that you place a comma before the end quotation mark, and then you have your attribution phrase, So, quote, "It's raining," comma, end quote, John said, period. Well, for some reason, my students almost universally tend to want to put a period after it's raining instead of a comma, and then have the attribution phrase, John said, period.
Wow.
So I don't
That's
understand
odd.
it.
Because anytime you read a book, if they read books, they'd see that it's not done that
Absolutely.
way.
And that's what you are saying is the fire that rages in my soul every time I see it. Why don't you know how to do this? So I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of I think with first time students, I see a lot of unpolished work technically like that. And then if you can sort of separate the students who are serious about what they're doing if that changes over the course of the semester.
Boy, isn't that the truth? Yeah. I mean, if you don't see action taken, if you don't see some kind of that they are listening and responding, that's clear indicator that they're not taking it seriously enough, that they're a dilettante. Let's wrap this up, Andy, by you telling us what you're working on now to whatever extent you can.
Sure. So I'm someone that, depending on what interview you listen to, I'll have a different answer for this almost every time. But I finally locked in on the next project, and I'm working on a book that I don't want to give too much away about it, but I am trying to do something in the vein of post-apocalyptic fiction. So it's kind of stretching the wheelhouse a bit for me. I'm aiming outside of horror. Elements of horror definitely are there, but I'm also aiming for fantasy and science fiction a little bit. So yeah, we'll see how that goes, but that's what I'm working on.
Wow, so it's a little step outside of what you've been doing, but the elements of horror will be there. Very, very good. Well, we'll look forward to that. My guest has been Andy Davidson. Again, his new novel is The Hollow Kind, that was released just in 2002, very recently. And a couple years prior to that, in 2020, The Boatman's Daughter. And in 2017, his first novel, In the Valley of the Sun, his first published novel anyway. Andy, this has been really fun and enlightening, and you're a great storyteller. And I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the program.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for having me.